Hello, everyone. I'm here with Professor Richard Albert, who is a famous and notorious constitutional law professor. He's a William Stamp Parish Professor in Law, Professor of Government, Director of Constitutional Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and he's a co-president of ICON-S. He's a leading scholar on constitutional change, and he's been around multiple courses, multiple countries. He's an outstanding person, and I'm having the honor and the benefit to be interviewing him after his visiting professor period in FGV School of Law at São Paulo. And Professor Richard is very generous, very thoughtful on his writings, his presentations, his talks, and his relations with faculty and students. And I hope you would very much enjoy our talk. Professor Richard, thank you for the time for us to talk and have this brief interview.
So good to see you. I'm just recently returned from my time with you in Sao Paulo. And so it's a pleasure to have the chance to see you again, and also to thank you one more time for your warm welcome to FGV. It was such a pleasure to be with you and your colleagues and your students.
So nice. Thank you, Richard. So you have this preeminent work on constitutional change and constitutional amendments. And I would like to start asking you, why do you think that this topic that is so relevant have been neglected for so long?
Yeah, constitutional amendment is such a technical subject. It's about the very intricate rules that we use to change the text of constitutions. Once upon a time, there were very important works written about constitutional amendment, the mechanistic procedures of amendment, and then not so much. And then there became a new wave of interest in informal changes to the text of constitutions, led by scholars whose names you certainly recognize, Bruce Ackerman and Akhil Amar. And I was their student at the Yale Law School. And so I got interested in how constitutions change informally. And then after law school, I started thinking about writing about the formal dimensions of change. And so that's when I really began to dive in to the deep end of constitutional amendment, not informal, but formal. And then after I really got comfortable with the procedures and mechanisms of formal constitutional change, I then, of course, started to think about and write about informal change. So I'm interested in really both kinds of constitutional changes, formal and informal, big and small.
Yeah, and another charming characteristic of your work is this empirical and comparative research you made on constitutional amendments, mainly on your last book, 2019, Constitutional Amendments. And you're not an armchair comparativist, right? You go to these places and you talk to the legal community. On this comparative work, what findings did you find most surprising?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I've learned a lot from traveling around the world to meet with scholars, to learn from scholars, and also from political actors and judges. And I've had the opportunity to do what I did at FGV at other places, which is to teach students. And in the course of teaching, I'm learning, because the students are certainly at FGV, they're exceptional students, and elsewhere too, I've had the chance to learn from them. And so when I travel to these countries, yes, I'm teaching, yes, I'm giving lectures, but I'm learning all the time. And so for me, it's a great opportunity to do that, ask questions. And so one thing that I really learned very well over the years of traveling to different countries, teaching courses, giving lectures, getting feedback, is something that I unveiled in an article that was published the year before I published my book, and then the book developed that a bit further. And this is the idea of a distinction between big changes and small changes. This does not map onto the distinction between formal and informal. No, completely different kind of a distinction. Formal change to the text of the Constitution. Informal change to the meaning of the Constitution, but without any change to the text of the Constitution. That's a different distinction from big changes and small changes. So I discovered that political actors around the world are using the procedures of constitutional reform to make changes that we can identify as small changes in terms of the impact they have on the Constitution and the constitutional order. And they're also using the same procedures to make big changes to the Constitution and the constitutional order. And what I found is that political actors often use the same procedures to make both kinds of changes because the Constitution provides only one path to constitutional reform. And sometimes political actors, they use a procedure for amendment to remake the Constitution from top to bottom. And so what you have is a new Constitution that's masquerading as a constitutional amendment. And so this is something that really troubled me in terms of what I learned, what I've been reading, and what I ultimately wrote about. And I created a distinction between the concept of a constitutional amendment and the concept of a constitutional dismemberment. Amendment being a small kind of a change that keeps the Constitution consistent and coherent with itself, and a constitutional dismemberment being a big, transformative, revolutionary kind of a change. And of course, after I described, identified, illustrated this distinction, I also had some prescriptions about what we can do to manage how political actors use their power of constitutional reform to make amendments in a responsible way and dismemberments in a responsible way too.
Amazing. And Richard, in this dismembering piece you work on, people should have a grasp of a sense of a theory of identity of their own constitution to identify these big changes. What would be your counseling for people that are trying to develop a sound and good theory of identity for their own constitutions?
So there are a couple of ways of doing this. And you're right to identify identity as one of the markers for what a constitutional dismemberment changes. It changes the identity of a constitution. But the distinction between an amendment and a dismemberment really turns on a few things. One is whether the change impacts the identity of the Constitution. If yes, it's a dismemberment. Whether the change impacts the basic structure of the Constitution. If yes, it's a dismemberment. Whether the change transforms in some way the fundamental rights and freedoms and liberties in the Constitution. If yes, that's a dismemberment. Other kinds of changes are going to be smaller in scope, smaller in scale. Those are amendments, kind of housekeeping, routine, mundane kind of changes that are necessary, but just not transformative in the same way that constitutional dismemberments are. And so you've asked the question, how do we know what falls in which category? Amendment versus dismemberment. And there are a couple of ways that we can make this distinction a bit clearer. One is that you put in the text of the Constitution what qualifies as an amendment and what qualifies as a dismemberment. So some constitutions around the world will create procedures for constitutional amendment and separately for constitutional dismemberment. And they'll say, if you want to make a big change, you have to use these procedures, and these are the kinds of changes that require to use these procedures. If you want to make small changes, you can use these procedures to make these kinds of changes. So for example, the Constitution of Switzerland does this. Of Austria does this. Spain, Ecuador, Chile, Canada. Yes? And so to figure out what counts as the identity or the basic structure or the fundamental rights and freedoms in a constitution, constitutional designers in these countries, Austria, Switzerland, Ecuador, Chile, etc., they have put in the text of the Constitution directions, instructions for political actors about what they must do if they want to change the identity of the Constitution, or change the basic structure of the Constitution, or change something about the fundamental rights and freedoms. They have a roadmap that they must follow. And that's clear because it's decided at the point of constitutional creation. Yes? And so the other way to determine what counts as a big change or a small change is in the context of, let's say, a constitution like yours, like in Brazil, where you don't distinguish between procedures for amendment and procedures for dismemberment, because you have one procedure to amend everything in the Constitution. Yes? Nonetheless, your Supreme Court has ruled that certain kinds of constitutional reforms are unconstitutional. And so when the court does that, what it's telling you and the world is that you cannot use the procedure of constitutional amendment to make these kinds of changes that qualify as these big transformative changes that will be inconsistent with the values of the Constitution. And so two ways that we can identify big changes or small changes: the Constitution, the text will tell you, or the court will tell you when it invalidates what it believes has been an effort to dismember the Constitution using the procedure of constitutional amendment.
Pastor Richard, those are great points and make me think regarding a specific example you have on your book, 2019 book, among several you wrote. Why a group of power that has power enough to dismember a constitution, to make such a drastic change, would pursue to do this in the formal rules of the Constitution? You bring on your book that you open the book with the example of China, well, where they changed the rules of limits for president mandates. And why would they pursue to change the Constitution if they have the power to make the changes independently? Why is it so important today to any group of power to show or try to show or persuade that they are in accordance with the formal proceedings of their Constitution?
I love this question because it's historical, it's theoretical, it's comparative, and it's political. I love this discussion. Thank you for asking me this. And thank you for mentioning the China example, which I discuss in the book, among many other examples from Turkey and Ireland, Italy, Brazil, Ecuador, Canada, many examples from all around the world. And the question you raise is, why would an authoritarian, why would a one-party state bother using the procedures of constitutional reform to change its constitution when it can just push through the change without any regard to procedural correctness? And this is a fascinating question, And I think it's because there's a culture of legality that constrains even authoritarians. And even if authoritarians don't honor the substantive values of constitutionalism, they do have regard to the procedural values of constitutionalism, because they are constrained by rules as well. And there are power struggles within these organizations that apply pressure on them to follow rules. And moreover, even if there aren't internal pressures, there are external expectations about how societies will govern themselves. Moreover, there may be outsider investments that they're trying to procure by showing that they're following the rules in their own constitution. And so what happens is a very interesting game. If you look at some of the authoritarian constitutions around the world, you'll see that the rights that they protect are very, very effusive. You have the right to food, right to a job, a right to welfare, a right to free expression, a right to run for a re-election, a right to do all of the things that we associate with liberal democracy. But yet, these authoritarian states don't protect these rights. And so they're playing a kind of a game, and they're trying either to fool the international community, which is hard to do because we know what happens in these jurisdictions, or they're trying to fool the internal community, their own citizens. And that's also hard to do, but easier to do when you control the means of communication. Yes? And when you can restrict what knowledge is being brought to bear into the country. And so your question about why authoritarians follow the rules is a fascinating one. And I guess I would just make one last historical point, Professor Rubens, which is there's a deep association between a constitutional text and the idea and aspiration of constitutionalism. Two very different things. Yes, the text and the principles. And if we think back to the design of the US Constitution in 1787, almost as soon as the US Constitution came into being, other countries started to write their own constitutions, try to follow suit. Poland and France were quickly thereafter, Haiti thereafter as well. None of those constitutions remains in force today, but Norway's constitution of 1814, still in force today. Belgium's constitution of 1815, still in force today. But it's not just those two constitutions, the democratic constitutions of Norway and Belgium, that are interesting to think about. It's interesting to think about the constitutions that were inspired by the US Constitution that have since been replaced time and time and time again. And what's happened is that there's been an association created between the text of a constitution and the principles of constitutionalism, and authoritarians have seized on this association to write constitutions for themselves, to give the people and themselves a constitution in order to suggest that what they're doing, that their project of governance is just like what the United States is doing with its project of democracy rooted in the Constitution. And so the false perception that authoritarians are trying to generate for their people is that if you have a text of a constitution, you're respecting the values of constitutionalism. And so it's a kind of a game that they're playing. And it all started with the writing, the codification, the formalization of the US Constitution and its long endurance. That has made it such that today, if you want to be a member of the international community, you need a codified constitution, unless you have some reason why not to have one. Like, for example, the UK doesn't have a single text, master text constitution, but it has a constitution in just an unusual, very interesting way. Unusual from the perspective of the United States. I mean, not unusual from the perspective of governance. No, completely fine to have a disaggregated, uncodified constitution.
That's such a great answer. And for our students that are listening to us, you made it sound so simple, and they may have the false impression that it's simple to obtain and to give this answer, like someone seeing a great show of dance or the Olympics or the World Cup, and you're seeing these athletes giving their best, and they're so good at it that they make it look like it's simple. And Professor Richard just gave this political, historical, normative, comparative, huge answer and made it very understandable and gave it a little taste of what it was like his course during his visit at FGV São Paulo. And for closure, I would like to hear a little bit on your thoughts on your course and if it has perchance impacted on your thoughts on any matter, on your research, your readings, etc.
I had a marvelous group of students in my course at FGV. It was a course that I called How Constitutions Change. And we met over the course of a week. I had students who were from Brazil at FGV. I had students who were exchange students from abroad. So there were students from Russia, Belgium, United States, Germany, Egypt. I mean, it was amazing. All of these different students from all around the world, and we were all talking about constitutions and constitutional change. We asked and discussed questions like, what makes a constitution endure? What makes a constitution die? How should we structure the rules of constitutional reform if we want to achieve certain values? What kind of Bill of Rights is best if you want to create a culture of constitutionalism and respect for the rule of the law? All of these questions, all about how constitutions change, and all with the different perspectives from students from their own jurisdictions. And so for me, it was an enriching experience to have the chance to learn from these students who are coming with very different kind of perceptions of the value, the functions, and the uses of constitutions. And so the conversations we had really, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, we've been talking for only 5 minutes. And then I looked at the clock and it was time to go. It was 3 hours, we're done, because the conversations didn't feel like work. They were effortless. And so that was a real gift to me, to have the chance to have these conversations with these students. And in the evaluation that I gave, I have to give an evaluation at the end of the course, a required essay that the students were able to write on their own time after the course ended. I asked the question, you are an advisor to the head of government of your country, and the head of government asks you for a memorandum advising on how to design the rules of constitutional reform for a new constitution. And so I read all of the answers that they gave, and they were really, really good. And they were drawing from our conversation in class, yes, from the readings that we read, yes, but they also brought new ideas into my own understanding of constitutions, ideas that were not in the assigned readings, that were not in the conversations, ideas that they generated on their own in preparing for this essay. So for me, it was a fabulous experience to have the chance to have these conversations and then to learn from their texts, from their essays. And so it's been very, very enriching for me.
Professor Richard Albert, a great researcher, a great professor, and a great person. Thank you so much for having this talk. Thank you so much for being at FGV as a visiting professor. It's been wonderful to meet you and to have this talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Rubens, and thank you to the entire FGV community for hosting me.